colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are connecting from. Welcome to the Annual General Assembly of the Global Donor Platform for Rural Development. Our third session today is on data for evidence-based policymaking. It fits extremely well in the program of the General Assembly and its narrative. After we explored through our high-level panel on Monday and the deep dive session yesterday, what are the main processes, level of coordination and financing that are needed to bring about a sustainable, equitable, and resilient transformation of food systems, today we are going to work on a few key questions that are essential if we want to understand what is feasible and what is our pathway moving forward. How can international organizations and development partners evaluate the agricultural interventions that can transform the lives and incomes of the world's poorest farmers while preserving the environment? How can we produce high quality and timely agricultural data and make evidence-based decision-making in agriculture the norm? How can agricultural transformation be data-driven? And most importantly, how does limited and uncoordinated support to agricultural data weaken the country's ability to drive an effective strategy for food systems transformation? Now, before I give the floor to our moderator for today and the amazing speaker lineup we have put together, let me remind you once again a few housekeeping rules. This session is live streamed on our donor platform website, so please share the link to the homepage across your network. I will also provide the link in the chat box very shortly. Please ensure that your audio is well set up. Use individual headsets to allow for better audio, and please limit ambient noise. Should you wish to intervene, raise your blue virtual hand on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will open your audio channel. Alternatively, you can also use the chat box to post your questions. When speaking, please talk directly into the microphone without turning your head away, and also ensure your camera is turned on. After you have spoken, please ensure that the microphone is muted. We will also have social media reporting. So if you use social media, you're most welcome to spread the word using the hashtag DonorsAGA2020. We'll also make sure that this is posted in the chat box for you to use. Now, let me give the floor to our moderator for today. The session will be facilitated by Ahmad Bahalim, Policy Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Ahmad, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Maurizio. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone virtually. Good morning from Seattle, where it's still dark outside, and good evening and good afternoon to those joining us from across the world. My name is Ahmad Bahalim. I'm a program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where I lead our global policy and multilateral engagement work in agricultural development. I'd like to begin by thanking the platform for hosting this conversation. It's quite important, quite timely. And specifically, I'd like to thank Jenna Slaughton and Vivi Feriani at the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data for organizing today's excellent panel. As we're waking up here in Seattle and as you're getting on with your day, we're witnessing a lot of uncertainty across news cycles. This is quite clearly a time of uncertainty for many of us. Fortunately, our conversation today offers results and actionable guidance. We're joined today by panelists who are improving our understanding of agricultural development by applying rigorous scientific methods for broad literature. They're gathering new data where it hadn't been collected before, and then colleagues are using that information to improve development outcomes in their own countries. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to offer some background. This conversation is a little old. In the wake of agreement on SDG 2 in 2015, a small group of representatives from donor agencies started meeting informally, where we were collectively struck by the ambition of SDG 2, but we didn't see a clear path to it. To start with, we didn't have the data to report on the SDG 2 targets and indicators. We didn't know scientifically what worked to improve smallholder productivity and income sustainably. SDG targets 2.3 and 2.4. The small group that came together a few years ago has now evolved into the SDG 2 Roadmap Working Group hosted by the Global Donor Platform. The panelists today represent grants made as a consequence of that working group coming together. From a donor perspective, we're now working together to collect the best data and generate the right evidence to inform decision-making. In a time like today, when there's doubt, it's invaluable to have a community which matches analytical rigor with ambition and action. For today's session, after introductions, I'll move to pose 2 questions to each of the panelists. They'll have approximately 4 minutes to answer. We'll then move to Q&A for what we hope is the bulk of the session. Colleagues from GPSTD will collect questions in the chat, and then I'll pose those to the panelists. With that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We're joined by Jaren Porciello, co-director of the CERES 2030 project. She's at Cornell University and is an information scientist. We are also joined by David Laborde, also co-director of CERES 2030. He's a senior researcher at IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute. We're also joined by Eliza Mohamedou. She's the program manager of 50 by 30, an initiative that's hosted at the World Bank, but is a partnership involving a number of countries and donor agencies to scale up the relevant agricultural surveys in 50 countries by 2030. And finally, we're joined by Thula Lenia, who is the coordinator at the Agricultural Transformation Office in the Ministry of Agriculture in Kenya. With that, thank you panelists for joining us. Thank you audience members for being here. Jaren, I'll turn to you for the first 2 questions. What is the state of agricultural research and evidence for SDG 2.3 and 2.4? And what do we know now that we didn't before? How can donors apply this evidence in support of their own agendas and priorities? And are there any opportunities to add to this evidence base in the future?
Great.
Over to you, Jaren.
Thanks. Thank you, Ahmad. And thank you, Ahmad and Maurizio, for the introductions, and to everyone for the invitation to be here today to share findings from CERES 2030, Sustainable Solutions to End Hunger. Excuse me. 3 years ago, Cornell University, the International Food Policy Research Institute, and the International Institute for Sustainable Development were asked 2 questions, as Ahmad referenced, on whether we could help them accelerate progress towards ending world hunger. The first question was, what are the most effective ways to end hunger, increase the incomes of poor farmers, and protect the climate? And the second question, what would it cost? The ambition was to support the United Nations 2030 agenda, which defines what success looks like across a global community trying to achieve ambitious humanitarian goals. Our focus was on SDG 2, the goal to end hunger. And I think the magnitude and the seriousness of the question demands that we think, act, plan, and galvanize globally. We're living in a moment in history where countless people in every country have discovered that food security is not permanent, and that the fall from food abundance to food scarcity can occur in a matter of weeks when one's access to income is upended. CERES 2030 brought together 84 researchers from 25 countries and 53 organizations. We asked senior editors at one of the most preeminent scientific publishers, Nature Research, to be our partners to evaluate our findings using traditional peer review and disseminate the research through scholarly channels. We invited a group of 20 leading food and agricultural experts to guide us on some of the questions that we should be asking. Importantly, we also worked with the donor community, in particular the SDG 2 donor working group that Ahmad referenced throughout this project. And there's 2 broad findings that I'd like to highlight from our work. First, we as the global community generate an impressive amount of research in science and agriculture, where the global production of knowledge is estimated to double every 9 years. One of my favorite estimates is from the journal Science, where they estimate that a new peer review article is published every 20 seconds. Despite these volumes of research, we found that there is not one single research idea or field that continually dominates. Instead, research continues to push forward many complementary solutions. And in CERES 2030, we group these solutions into 3 big buckets. First, interventions on the farm to directly improve productivity and incomes. The second, investments to improve storage and services that farmers need to move food to the markets. And third, we found that if we want any of this to work, that we need to empower the excluded by ensuring every person's right to an education, a decent livelihood, and a political voice. And what these buckets do is they enable us to see solutions as a portfolio of interventions that constantly interact and reinforce each other. But our second finding, however, is that we also find there is a significant gap in the kind of research that can help us close the last mile between research and impact. Less than 10% of the studies that our researchers looked at included farmers or other beneficiaries as part of the analysis, even when studies were promoting a solution for farmers. We need to increase opportunities to link research and impact. And briefly, let me address the second question. How can donors apply this evidence in support of their own agendas and priorities? And are there opportunities to add to the evidence base in the future? Despite challenging times, I still think that most of us believe and are guided by decisions that are informed by evidence and data. Data and evidence give us a window into the ways that we are cooperating and where scaling up is working. And when I think about evidence and data, I'm reminded of the saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And so while our researchers and our global community were synthesizing the evidence, we were simultaneously building a sophisticated economic model to find the answer of what would it cost. And my colleague, David Laborde, will speak about this in a moment. But I just want to highlight that what we found is donors need to give an extra $14 billion per year from now until 2030. And this means that donors need to double their current spending on food security. And in some ways, this is quite underwhelming because this is how close we are. For an extra $11 per person living in the industrialized world, we could bring about a sustainable end to hunger. It's in our reach. And an extra $14 billion is enough to end hunger, double the incomes of poor farmers, and keep greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture below the Paris Climate Agreement. But what it requires is a commitment for us to change our own behaviors and practices and beliefs. And it requires access to data because data helps to hold us accountable to our previous commitments, and it tells a story about what we value. And I think my colleagues on the panel today will continue to help us elaborate on these messages. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Taryn. I'd like to move on to David. David, same format, 2 questions to you, 4 minutes for you to respond. Why is an economic model like the one used in Series 2030, why is it important to assess ODA needs? Secondly, to which extent does having household data improve donor spending or guiding it?
Thanks a lot, Ahmad, and thanks everyone for being here, and thanks Aaron for already giving some background about the project we have collaborated during the last few years. So let me start by saying something that everyone knows, I hope, that the world is incredibly complex and has become more and more complex over time, with society growing, with countries interacting with each other. And we have to acknowledge the fact that, our own individual human mind have our own limitation. And therefore, to understand and describe this complexity, we need to rely on a mathematical model, and in this case, an economic model, that will show the interaction of the livelihood, of the production and consumption decision of millions of people in different settings that will basically generate the outcome that is the world we live in today. And we should never oversimplify, meaning that we are dealing with heterogeneous situation across country, within country, across household, and within household. And of course, even if some simple stories about, is this household is going to decide to plant cassava or maize during this year, really, when you put them all together, that's when the challenges occur. And you cannot just look at a specific story, a specific data point, a specific mechanics to make so much important decision, and in particular to decide to allocate resources in an efficient way to achieve the SDG goal that we have decided. You need understanding, you need planification, so you need this modeling, and of course, you need the data. because the pattern of the societies we are living in is really driven by this web of destinies, and once again, that go across borders. And that's why also having this global perspective, because when you are, especially for donors, you are interested to achieve these global goals, and what type of intervention I'm going to do in a specific countries, but also how, if I, for example, decide to invest a lot in the maize sector in one country, what it will mean for the neighboring countries, okay? There is a need to coordinate action and basically to optimize spending across country, across intervention, and this is why we need this type of model, because just a collection of simple stories doesn't give you the big picture. And as we have shown, you know, achieving this end of hunger in a sustainable way is something feasible from a fiscal point of view. So we're not talking about $100 billion, but it has to be done. We have to spend the money wisely, both learning from evidence, as Jaron has explained, but also in understanding this interaction between intervention. If you do a lot of R&D, but it's not adopted, basically, it's useless. So why people doesn't adopt? Is it a question of institution? Is it a question of price for the good they are going to produce? So if you give me a technology that increases yield, but the price of corn is very low, you will not see adoption. So combining, you know, market access intervention, technological innovation, but also providing this framework in the institution that creates some resilience to make sure that people that are going to adopt new technology, for instance, will keep them is so important. And of course, this household story and the household data are so important because people are different, you know, different production, different type of household. Some can really become producers that will market their production and therefore will generate income, when other actually may be so vulnerable that we will need to find other solution like social safety net to make sure that they can increase their livelihood. Because if you are 65 years old and you are a small farmer with 1 hectare, it's not by extension services or training that you are going to change your life in the future. So really, that's what is important. And I mean, thanks to the initiative, we can do some research and guide policy today like we never was able to do in the past. We have more powerful computers, we have more data. Hopefully, we may have policymakers that are more open to this process of decision making. But what's happened for household is important, but we also have to think about the frontier that is what is happening within household. You know, when we think about gender issues, when we think about nutrition issue, there's a lot of things that happen within household. And so when we collect data, you know, mainly in this project, we have tried to use all the household data, but what is happening within household is important. And also collect information on topics that were maybe not important 20 years ago, like biodiversity and so on. We need to collect them in order to understand and to design actions. Sometimes we have challenges and we don't know about them, and that's a main problem. Thank you.
Ahmad, you're on mute.
Thank you. Turning to Elisa. 2 questions for you, 4 minutes to respond. What are the main problems in agricultural data? How does the 50 by 30 initiative try to narrow the agricultural data gap? And how does this initiative create a sustainable flow of reliable and accurate information for decision making? And what are the challenges you've started to see with implementation?
Okay, the critical problem is really the lack of data for key agriculture indicators, specifically the SDG 2 on zero hunger, whether we're looking at labor productivity, 231, or smallholder income, 232, or land area under sustainable production, 241. So the majority of low income and lower middle income countries don't have the basic data to calculate them. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's less than half of the countries have the basic data needs that are met. And that's really because of a lack of regular agriculture surveys. And this affects human lives. Let's not forget that close to 80% of the world's poorest population live in rural areas, and it also has an enormous economic impact. One of our implementing agencies, the FAO, estimates that $240 billion are invested each year in agriculture in low and middle income countries. And that's really based on decisions that are made without the benefit of recent, comparable, or agricultural statistics. But the problem in agriculture data is much more than the lack of basic data to measure SDG2 indicators. In Africa, for instance, in addition to the lack of SDG2 indicators, we are lacking as well the data for the continent's own development agenda through the Malabo Declaration on Accelerated Agriculture Growth and Transformation. And that touches really on very specific indicators for the continent relating to the proportion of men and women engaged in agriculture that have access to financial services, or those that have access to agriculture advisory services, or data specific on national priority commodities. But beyond data collection, another issue that exacerbates the problem includes the disconnect between data available vis-a-vis the data needed for policies, decisions, planning, and investment. And this really, one of the areas we're very concerned about, of course, is the gaps in sex disaggregated data. And I'll just give you one number, which is really that less than a dozen developing countries are actually recording progress at varying years on SDG 5A1, which tracks the percentage of people with ownership or secure rights over agricultural land. So that's really some of the problems in agriculture data. So now how the initiative tries to narrow that data, global agriculture gap, we have a three-pronged approach. So on data production, data use, and the development of innovations in data collection methods and tools. And each part reinforces the efficacy of the other. So for data production, with the FAO leading, the initiative is promoting and supporting a flexible integrated survey system to generate the key data to compute not only SDG2 indicators, including sex disaggregated data, but also regional and nationally relevant data. And we link that in the questionnaire design process. We work both on data quality and cost effectiveness, because the feasibility of implementation is essential to the initiative. The other component is on methods and tools component, which is led by the World Bank. And there we promote and incorporate innovation in data collection. So for instance, combining survey data with Earth observation data, specifically on crop type mapping and yield estimation is one of the areas where we hope to develop also guidelines for countries. And the third component is really about ensuring that the data produced informs policy needs through the data use, and that's led by EFAT within the initiative. And so that's really about building the capacity and motivation of key actors. And those are decision makers, but also civil society, academia, to use the data to inform decisions, but also to build the capacity and influence the priorities of the statistical units and researchers to align with the needs of decision makers. And that's really because within the initiative, we recognize that supply side efforts focused on data production alone are unlikely to increase evidence use in decision making. And so partnerships is really an important feature of the 50 by 2030 initiative. We have a powerful alliance of 5 development partners, 4 regional representatives that have been nominated by the high-level group that the United Nations Statistical Commission has set up for the 2030 agenda. We have 3 partner implementing agencies, the FAO, World Bank, and EFAT, and with time, the 50 countries. And we also want to reach out to the private sector. And so the initiative really is going to promote strong coordination among the partners with other programs as well. And it's no coincidence that the 2 programs featured in this event, CERIS and ourselves, are funded by Germany and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, because this is really about ensuring synergies between our efforts and also showcasing the cumulative impact of in the area of data smart agriculture. And so that's really one thing that we want to also work on through developing our sort of bringing together the interventions at the country level. And there's one thing that we're particularly working on, which is trying to bring together the activities around data statistical capacity building at the country level that we want to do through a portfolio of interventions at the country level, both to integrate what everyone is doing, but also to lower the burden on countries in terms of engaging with different stakeholders. One thing that, do you want me, Amma, to go through all of your questions at once, or do you want me to look into the challenges as well now, or?
I think we're coming up on time in terms of the first round. Maybe we come back to the rest when we tackle Q&A with the audience. That's okay.
Okay, sure.
Super. Thanks so much for that. I'd now like to turn to Thula. Again, same format, 2 questions, 4 minutes. Why does having timely, reliable, and accurate data matter for agricultural transformation in Kenya? And secondly, how have recent experiences, particularly with COVID-19 response and the desert locust crisis, how have they changed how you think about the role of data in driving agricultural transformation?
Thanks, Aman, for the questions. So in the context of Kenya, as one of the lower middle income countries, and then being called the Silicon Savannah, in the agricultural context in Kenya, we are a devolved sector, which means we have to work in both national and county level requirements with regards to, one, on the policy side, and then with implementation of the policies being made with regards to agriculture. So, and then secondly is that we're a dual system, which is that we have small scale farmers, of course, and then we have the large scale producers, which ideally would then be the ones that support a lot of our food security requirements, because as one of our panelists mentioned earlier, you know, you can't rely on a 65-year-old on a 1 acre plot to then have a response to your food security requirements. So what has helped us, like in this administration now, in terms of how we ensure that we have, why we're using data, is because before, a lot of our policy interventions were anecdotal. It was based on people's assumptions or no tracking of information. And now what we're installing as part of the Agriculture Transformation Office is support to the Cabinet Secretary's office with regards to data visualization, data processing, data and analysis, to ensure that when we make a suggestion, for example, like one of the things we gazetted early on this year was the importation of 4 million bags of maize. And that was a direct result of having information with regards to maize availability and pricing and accessibility across the country, and recognizing that we needed both interventions for both human consumption and for our animal feeds. And then obviously more recently with COVID, and then, well, in fact, before COVID, we had the locusts. The same way, we were caught a little bit flat-footed, but that was because it's been the biggest invasion, as we call it, in the last 75 years. So having data going back 75 years, we couldn't have predicted this if we didn't have the data. And now what we're working on is making sure that we have a command center specifically for our early warning systems. One, on climatic issues, because in Kenya, we don't work, if 65% of our agriculture produce is from small scale farmers, not under irrigation, they rely on climate, right? So it's rain-fed production. We need to be able to respond, especially to those who are highly affected by drought and those affected by floods. We've had, fortunately, looking at now, we've put in flood warning systems through the Kenya CAOP, Kenya Agriculture Observatory platform, which uses data, which is climatic data, for us to then forewarn and be able to then respond. But on COVID specifically, what we realized is that there's skills gaps on the ground with regards to data collection and data processing. The national government had to step in to support all our counties to ensure that we, one, had an idea of how the market protocols were being implemented, and that required having people on the ground, them collecting data on how people are accessing food, the price of the food, where it is, and how it is being delivered to the markets. But we recognize now that we need to have support in terms of capacity building. 47 counties is quite a few. We currently have 335 counties. Now this is last week's data from KNBS, 335 county markets between livestock and crops, and fish markets. And all of those need to be monitored in terms of, one, on the COVID protocols, because that's where a lot of our rural communities are then picking up COVID from, but also in terms of where food is available, the hotspots in terms of price spikes, as well as where food is not available. And then, in terms of the ministry, we certainly need to also have a focused effort on internal culture change with regards to data. A lot of it is just still the statistics department, but as I'm always telling my colleagues as directors, and obviously the CS also echoing it, is that data is the only way that we're going to make decisions that really affect people on the ground. And for us, it's important now that we look at how we're going to ensure there's resiliency in all our digital innovations. We can't have just support from 1 year because we've had COVID. We need to look at what does it take for it to become part of our daily lives when it comes to work. So for us, it's really important now. The focus now is about changing the mentality and culture that it's not an emergency response when it comes to collecting data, but part of how you work on a daily basis. Thanks.
Wow, thank you. Extremely insightful and relevant to the conversation today. So many themes to pick up there. I'd like to now turn to the floor for question and answer. If you can, please feel free to plug in your questions in the chat, and they'll be collated, collected, and then posed to the panelists. Since I have the prerogative as the chair to maybe start the conversation off with some questions, I'll probably, what I'll suggest is a few questions or themes for the overall panel, and for Elisa to specifically to come back to the question of the challenge. So overall themes, I guess, just listening to the conversation today, it's quite clear that it's not enough for us to make policy decisions based on anecdotes. So that's an important highlight that I just took away from Gula. But there are a lot of other issues that are emerging. So, we just heard about desert locusts, the climate crisis. We're in the midst of a global pandemic. Clearly, there are a lot of challenges that we're facing that aren't necessarily specifically SDG 2.3 or 2.4. So to Jaren, what can the scientific literature say about these emerging issues or challenges that go beyond very specific targets or goals? So as we look beyond SDG 2.3 and 2.4, in terms of your work, what can the evidence tell us about the climate crisis? What are the things that we need to do in terms of thinking of early warning systems, as Phil just noted? To David, as we think about modeling the impact of the COVID crisis, the desert locust crisis, how do these kinds of economic shocks in the near term, how do they relate to the longer term goals that we're trying to achieve over the SDG 2 period? And Elisa, finally, just to come back to the question that you were addressing earlier, the challenges that you're facing in implementation, what are they? What do they look like? And what might colleagues that are here today online with us, what could we potentially do about it? So I'll pause there and turn it over to the panelists to tackle those questions.
Do you have a specific order that you want to go in, Ahmad?
Yeah, Jaren, if we just go in the order that I listed things out, yeah.
Great. So to the question of what can the scientific evidence tell us kind of more broadly beyond SDGs 2.3 and 2.4, and you specifically mentioned, climate change and climate adaptation. What I think we can say with some kind of certainty is that we see a lot more interdisciplinary work from researchers coming together from many fields to work on these challenges. And I think that that's a really important takeaway for us, because it tells us that there's a lot more ideas coming forward from not only climate scientists and plant scientists, but social scientists, economists, geographers, who really are working on these as sort of an interdisciplinary approach. And what we see is that this gives us kind of a more holistic look, obviously, at how, findings from one discipline can be influenced and informed by others. I would say too that one really important takeaway, kind of at maybe the social science level for us to think about, is that when we want to bring interdisciplinary groups together to work on these challenges, it's not enough to just say, hey, here's a great idea and here's a great group of people. We actually need to really think pretty clearly about the kind of standardized frameworks and methodologies that can help people work through these problems and build common ground. And if I can just give kind of one quick example, maybe from a community where I think is sort of leading the way and helping us think about this space, pretty intently. I would say that the gender community actually has an awful lot of kind of frameworks, and they've thought a lot about how to integrate gender into other disciplines rather than leaving it as sort of an aside. But really, what are the frameworks, tools, data collection methods, measures, and methodologies that are needed in order to kind of bring gender more, really situate gender within the conversations rather than outside of it. And that's, to me, again, that's an important takeaway, because if we want to have these kind of holistic solutions come forward on areas like climate change and climate adaptation, then we need tools, frameworks, and data to really help people settle in and work pragmatically on other solutions.
Thanks, Sharon. That was very helpful. There's I see two more questions in the chat that are coming up. There's one addressed to you, but I think David might be better placed to tackle it. So I'll turn to David for that. David, one question from me, what's the role of economic shocks? How are you thinking about that? How is that modeled in your work? The question from the audience, from Maurizio, now that we have a powerful figure of 14 billion a year, in terms of additional need for investment in the sector. What has the study, what has your work done in terms of exploring how to distribute these resources? We will not only need to make this money available, but we'll also need to have an idea on how to spend it. And how can platforms like GDPRD help this process? Is it through coordination only?
Thanks for the questions, both questions. So I will start by saying that, this type of crisis is helping creating also awareness about the lack of data that we have sometimes, because, for example, people come to us and say, what is the impact of COVID-19 on women productivity in agriculture? And in many cases, we have to tell them, even without COVID-19, we have a doubt about that. So this COVID-19 crisis, like other crises, because it creates an emergency for policymakers and the society, help to be more honest about what we know, what we don't know. And if you are not make a preparatory work, meaning that if you don't have the tool and the data to help decision makers during the crisis, it's not in the middle of crisis that you make this type of investment. So I just really want to stress this fact. Of course, the crisis itself has an impact on achieving the SDG, but it shows the role of being prepared to this crisis, because there is always a crisis coming, and it can be driven by weather, it can be driven by pest and disease, it can be driven by conflict, and we just want to make sure that everyone is ready for it. So now about how this short-term shocks are affecting the more long-term development goals. That's a very critical question. In CEST 2030, we have tried really to explain that some of the challenges we face and why we have populations that are excluded from income growth or from achieving a high level of food security is by lack of capital, different type of capital. And how the crisis is going to impact this capital, basically this stock, is how we are going to have a legacy of this shock in the future. If we think about human capital, is this crisis is going to reduce access to education or access to nutrition? Because it means that, yes, in 5-10 years, you will have people that went through this crisis, in particular kids, that will have a lower productivity, potentially all their life, if they have been deprived from this opportunity to create their human capital during this period. So protecting them is so important. Similarly, social capital, particularly in COVID-19. If you cannot have social interaction, smallholders working together to access inputs, to negotiate better prices, that can also weaken their economic position for the future. And building networks take time. Financial capital, of course, in the middle of the crisis, we have seen donors reacting and trying to provide new fundings, both at the national level and international level. We have seen the financial sector, the central bank trying to protect this. So access to financial capital is important. But we have to think that we may leave this crisis with a large level of public debt. And it's at this time that we can start to see people cutting expenditure. And here also we need to make sure that in 3-4 years, when it will be about paying the debt of the COVID-19 crisis, in particular in the richer economies, we don't start to cut ODA or other way to fund all the effort we have to do to achieve in 2030. Because if I take a continent like Africa, the development needs on all the SDGs are so big that it's obvious that they will have no enough financial resource locally to do it. And same thing when I think about knowledge capital. We need still to invest in technology, in research and development, in understanding also traditional technology and how they can contribute to climate resilience. But it means that we need to spend money in building this knowledge. And if everyone wants to say, now, okay, we have to invest in health, and all the next PhD have to be in health, we will not have in I would say in agronomics, in soil science, soil science is very important. And so making sure that in the middle of the crisis, we are not also just reallocating to the hot topic. It's important because the world of tomorrow is coming from the investment of today in all of these dimensions that you see. It's not just about money, it's what we do with money, who has access to it, that is so important. So about the question that is coming from Mauricio. So we have, with this type of analysis, an idea, more than an idea, we have numbers about which type of intervention, in which combination, in different locations of the world. We are not coming to the question about who is paying for it, in particular among donors, meaning an allocation. Something that actually we lack evidence of is what the different type of donors may be good at, Our people have really good skill in irrigation, and we say, okay, 2 donors can say, I am going to take a large chunk of the payment in irrigation in most countries, but you have to do R&D, and another one has to do making sure that we are road or at least market regulation that avoid power distortion that will give very low price to some producers. And the question is how you coordinate this. I think it's so important, because if you do irrigation alone, or if only one donor do irrigation and the rest, for example, of the value chain intervention are not developed by someone else, it will not get a high return on his investment. And this part, about how to allocate tasks to international donors, but also local stakeholders, local government, because they are the ones that will also at the end do the bulk of the work. This question of coordination is not something we have looked at from an institutional point of view, even if in terms of numbers and actually what can be modeled, we have this type of allocation. Thank you. Oh, maybe I will just say, a model is always a simplification of the reality. So it's very important to take this type of number and see after on the ground how they are perceived, how they are fitting in past strategy, how the various stakeholders react to them. It's a more, a strategic guide and the starting of a discussion than the blueprint that you paste and copy and say, okay, because we have this result of the model, this is what we have to do. No, the world is a bit more complex, but at least the model is showing, the alternative, the trade-off, the best optimization. That should be the start of the discussion, clearly not the end. Thank you.
David, while I still have you, just one clarification question that's coming through the chat. In your work, in your modeling work specifically, there's discussion of mobilizing additional investment from the private sector. Paul's asking, can you explain who you mean by the private sector? Are you talking about primarily big companies like Yara Fertilizer, or small companies like local equipment makers or farmers themselves? So just a clarification on your modeling.
So when we talk about private investment in a work, it's everyone. And knowing that a bulk of the investment is actually done by the smallholders that, because they are going to have higher income, I mean, in this project, we're interested in ending hunger, generating more income in a way that protect the climate. And of course, when you give them more money, they will spend it on food, for their own food security on the short term, on health, on education for their kids, but also on their farm. And that's what will happen everywhere on a systematic basis. Of course, big investment are also needed. But typically, if you are a private companies, you are going to invest where you make more profits, okay? So it may not be where you have the more excluded people. When people that are highly in a smallholder that is very in a food insecure situation has a lot of incentive to invest on his farm or on other activities around his farm that will help him addressing the issue. I hope I've clarified, but of course we can follow bilaterally.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that, David. That's quite helpful. I'll now turn to Elisa. There are two very good questions that they're quite directly addressed to you, I feel. So what are the basic steps for developing countries like Nigeria to start gathering data on SDG2 is one from Ifeoluwa. And another from Jenny about the importance of intra-household data and how not just household head is key. Can you expand on areas and findings that relate to the variables and outcomes that are key to including spousal modules or parcel manager modules to collect data beyond the household level? For example, in land tenure, we've found recently in Ghana that women are more likely to move off farm labor. So with that, over to you, Elisa.
Thanks, Ahmad. So interestingly, for Nigeria is one of the initiative countries. So we will soon start also continuing work we've started already. And Nigeria has an agriculture census coming up. So that's something we'll work on. The way the countries engage with us in particular is we develop with the 3 implementing agencies a program of support that we work with them about 5 to 8 years. Which is the estimated time where we provide technical and financial support with the view that the countries take over financially and technically after that cycle of support. So that's how we go. In terms of the land tenure is actually one of the areas that one of the components led by the World Bank is working on, because that's absolutely an issue in terms of collecting data and how to do it, and also using proxies as well with when it comes to gender data. I wanted to touch upon one of the issues that also David mentioned, which is about coordination. And so the initiative is, we're not looking at coordination in an abstract or sort of a theoretical way. It's really one of the challenges because we're bringing together 3 implementing agencies, each one of them with their practices and own expertise, as well as multiple development partners providing support to various countries in similar related agriculture programs. So that's really, really something that we will be developing throughout the years as well, and really providing hopefully a sort of a way of how it can be done in this area. Going back to your question as well, Ahmad, earlier, another issue that we have, of course, is country coordination, in particular at this time, because a number of the planned activities in partner countries, for example, data collection and training of field personnel, have been delayed because of the pandemic. Technical assistance and intervention at country levels is severely constrained because of the travel restrictions, but this also forces the initiative and others to rethink the modality of implementation, where, for instance, in one of the data collection activities, we're looking into in using a lot more of the regional expertise that is available. And one of the points as well that David mentioned is really the issue of making agriculture data visible in a landscape of global development priorities. And in that sense, the country ownership is, as I mentioned, is one of the examples of the initiative. And just as Ceres does it, one of the ways we have seen that we can counter this is with hard evidence, is really presenting the country with what it will cost to produce and use the data over a certain number of years, so that we can actually counter this idea that this may be beyond feasibility, and we're calling for domestic resource mobilization and factor it in our interventions. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. I'll turn to Thule for, I guess, two questions that are coming through, and I'm going to repurpose and repose them to you. One from both Maurizio and Fabrizio, relating to the role of institutions like the Global Donor Platform. You know, how can this kind of work be coordinated in a way that's beneficial to you as you're doing work in country on agricultural transformation? So one overarching question of how should or could donors coordinate together to address country demand or country-led needs? And then secondly, from Tim, I see a question about governments and donors, that they're reluctant to allocate resources to early warning systems, something that you mentioned explicitly, even though the cost-benefit ratios are quite positive. The lack of surveillance for locusts is a great example. Perfect, Tim. How can development partners resolve this challenge, and what, from a government perspective, is needed there? So over to you with that.
Thanks, Ahmed, and thank you, participants, for the question. Okay, so on coordination, I will just speak on the Kenyan context. Because we have installed my office being the Agriculture Transformation Office, it is literally the arm for coordinating between our intergovernmental stakeholders, because of course agriculture sector doesn't work just on its own. It needs support from land, from water, electricity when we're looking at our irrigation schemes, and also on our post-harvest losses. But with regards to donors, we have now implemented a system for coordination through ARD partners, and I'm sure some of them are on this call. And it is important for our donors to support coordination entities that are then established by our national governments or even county governments, because it can be the mouthpiece that allows for one, interventions on policy, but two, ensuring that whatever projects are implemented are actually having the best impact. You know, because I recently joined the ministry, and when I look at some of the work that's already been done over the last decade, the focus has been a little bit narrow, and everyone is like, they jump on bandwagons, you know. So if we're focused on the dairy value chain this season, everyone is talking about the dairy value chain, and that doesn't support food security. It just, you know, creates disparities within value chains. And then the following season, we've realized that we needed to also support the feedlots, to ensure that there were vaccinations, to ensure that there was post-harvest support, that there was access to the market. So for me, a coordination platform allows for our donors to then say, for us as government, to have a more open dialogue with regards to how we develop our interventions to support especially our small-scale producers. And then on the second question, I hope that answers the question, on the early warning system, it is new for a lot of us, but unfortunately, or fortunately, the silver lining from COVID in particular and locusts is that government has had to relook at saying, okay, as much as we want to always be reactive, it costs us, like you said, it costs us a lot more money with regards to the interventions we have to do for the communities affected by both climate and specifically pests. If we had information that, or at least ensured continual support of surveillance, we would then have had a more appropriate response. But let me also, on this caveat, the locusts, like I said, you know, we looked at all the data. It's the worst case we've had in the last 75 years. So even the Desert Locust Control, DLCO, the office for the region was unprepared. So it's also clear that even when we talk of preparedness and early warning systems, we have to then use that data to then be able to ascertain the patterns and the likelihood of the veracity of some of these shocks to our production systems. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll now turn to all the panelists, I think, to tackle a question that Paul's laid out, which I think is quite relevant, quite interesting. At the same time, I'd also like to invite participants to chime in with additional questions. We do have the panelists here for a bit longer, and it'd be great to prick their brains collectively. So I'll turn to all of the panelists in order. If you could tackle this question posed by Paul. So there was an increase in donor funding for ag development after the food crisis in 2008. but it wasn't sustained. And I think that's largely why we're here. But over the past 5 years, we've seen global hunger numbers go up again, quite troublingly. What do you see as the most effective arguments to convince donors of the importance of investing in ag and food systems now? So if we could have Jaren respond in the order that we've had.
Great. So thanks, Paul. I think you bring up an incredibly difficult question, right, to really answer and inform. Maybe there's 2 points that I would like to kind of address with regards to this question. First is I think that it would be good to maybe hear a little bit more from this donor community about the ongoing coordination efforts that you have and that you faced in the wake of 2008, maybe until present. And I say that from the perspective of wanting to have a better understanding of how donor decisions and allocations are made. So who has competitive advantage where, to think about where to increase, how to increase, and when. And so maybe a little bit of dialogue about where donor coordination has continued to happen and maybe where it's faltered from the 2008 food price crises until present. I think that's one way. In terms of kind of the messages that we want to be able to give to donors, I think that there's no question that, food insecurity and where we want to see agricultural-led economic growth and reductions in poverty, we see an intersection happening within the food and agriculture space. And so as we're trying to address these multiple challenges of reductions of poverty, as well as increases in economic-led growth so that countries can assume more stable levels of growth within their own countries, we always kind of come back to these intersections of food and agriculture. And so the ways into kind of how to extrapolate these messages and also to think through when we're trying to tackle these, what we're trying to really tackle are improvements in many different rural communities. And I think what the data and evidence can give us, and what my colleagues are highlighting on the panel today, is that when we think about the heterogeneity of data and of evidence, then we can begin to see a much more granular look at all of the problems that we face. And it really only is by getting at the granularity of what do we mean by farmers and poor farmers and people who are, urban poor versus rural poor. When we look at these data problems as people problems, then I think that we can uncover a whole nother level of a conversation that we can have. But that can only be done when we have access to granular data and granular evidence. Why don't I leave off there? I'm happy to go into more detail on any of those points, but I want to give my colleagues a chance to respond as well. Thank you.
Thank you. The same question, David, and I think there's an additional question that I see in the chat. So I'll let you respond to the first question first and come back to you on an additional question subsequently.
Yes, thanks. So yes, it's not a surprise, when you start to have a fire, people are ready to pay for the fireman, but when the fire has been extinguished, then no one wants to invest in the next fire truck. So that's this issue. We know that for most of the even overall policy-related questions, we see this cycle of focused. I really want to acknowledge the fact that donors have increased after the previous crisis, their spending in ag development, and some donors have also continued. So not every donor has stopped to invest in agriculture after the crisis. But we have this challenge because we also understand that for policymakers, they see a crisis, they want to solve the crisis, and so they are going to spend more money. And after they move to the next crisis in another domain, in another field, in another location. While actually we need to maintain the effort in investment, because the goal of most of the things we try to look at in this rural development strategy is to avoid a number of crises, to increase the livelihood of people, not to just make survive, and a lot of the investment that we are making are going to make the communities much more resilient when the next crisis will happen. So it's really an investment to avoid to have to deal with a large fire in the house. So this is also this perception. But we have to acknowledge that if you are in front of your parliament, it's much more easy to say, I'm going to increase my spending if you see a big food security crisis with higher food prices around the world, then if you just say, we need to invest in order that in the next 10 years, we don't see this crisis happen, so at least the effect will be limited. So creating awareness, bringing data, also providing foresight, to explain what can happen, but also how the investment we make are going to mitigate the next crisis is important. And at the same time, when in some part of the world we have seen this increase in the number of people impacted by hunger, it's not everywhere. So you have countries that are making big progresses. So all this money is actually quite useful. It's not like if we have wasted this money. I think it's very important because without it, the level of hunger will be much, much higher, okay? Because the population is growing, the demand is growing, the climate and the weather have deteriorated in many locations. And then there are things that are, I would say, beyond our control, conflict, and how the rural development investment can reduce the probability of conflict or help, that's a very complex issue. But obviously, that's not something that is within the control of the type of policies we do. Social stability is key to get all of the benefits we are talking about here. So that's really something we should think, peace is a necessary condition to most of the investment we do. Without making this investment, the level of hunger will be much, much higher. So it's always, what if that we have to keep in mind. After, just because population is growing, well, yes, without any action, we will see more and more hungry people. We see it in some locations, but overall, this spending has already contributed a lot. Now we need to do a bit more, especially if our target is 2030. We just have 10 years. So we need to spend more and relatively quickly. Otherwise, we will not be on target, but that's also how policymakers have to be accountable of the target they have recognized for the world.
Thank you, David. You're a prolific user of data, at least in my experience working with you. I see a question here in the chat box that I think you could tackle quite well. It's from Leopold. I'll pose it. So what are the SDG2 targets and themes for which data gaps are most prevalent? David mentioned that data on biodiversity was scarce. Can we say that a particularly strong need for data on the impact of food systems transformation on natural resources, biodiversity, capacity for climate change mitigation? Are there other such areas beyond biodiversity? So I suppose, what are the big data gaps that you're quite often dealing with, David, in your day-to-day work? And what are they beyond biodiversity? Could you detail that a little bit?
Yes, no. So I'm using data to fit the economic model, but I'm just using data because they are the way that we can perceive reality on a systematic basis. And we should not talk about a topic if we don't have evidence and data on it. Otherwise, we are just trying to get people with anecdotic evidence, and that's not very safe. I don't think that you would like to be in a plane where the pilot will say just, I believe that the weather will be good, or that the land, we can land easily, even if I don't see the ground. So you see, data is key in the way that we are looking at this, both for analysts, policymakers, and all of that. I will say, yes, clearly there is notion that the global community has started to look at in the last 10, 15 years in terms of biodiversity, and biodiversity is a relatively complex notion that can operate at different levels. Are we talking about genetic biodiversity of crops? Are we talking about biodiversity of species in the landscape? Are we talking about biodiversity on a global level and how you manage the great mammals population or the sea biodiversity? So there's a lot of notions, and for most of them, we have just left the period where we have conceptualized relatively well what we want to look at, but now we collect data. And of course, we will never really have data that will allow us to go back in time to understand what has happened in the last 15 years or how some policies have really impacted things in the last 15 years. So, but at the same time, I want also to be clear that even for a number of countries and before the 50 by 30 initiative, we didn't have an agricultural census. So even talking about biodiversity, understand what has been produced in some countries in the last 5 years and by who, and with which type of level of productivity is already a challenge. And now if you ask, okay, but with which technology, what type of inputs, that's even more challenging. So of course we have all these new questions that are very important and that reflect the diversity of the SDG in terms of biodiversity, gender, and on which we were not good at collect data in the past, and now we start to do it. But there are also some basic needs that still need to be addressed and on which we need to continue to have this information. Because, for instance, just having a set of household survey, but not an agricultural census that don't give us the picture about what's happening for the mid-size or the larger farms will not be enough. We need both. And I think that has been well acknowledged by the people in this panel. But yes, we need new data, but we should not be over-optimistic about where we are, even in the traditional data.
Thank you, David. I've got two questions that I'll turn to Eliza for. One that's rather philosophical from Suchit. Do smallholder farmers really benefit equally or even at all from the benefits of data sharing? Moreover, do all stakeholders in the agricultural sector have the same access and control to these insights? That's a quite heavy question, Eliza. So I'll give you as much time as you need to respond. There's another question from Efeula about, I think this is sort of fundamentally a philosophical question about the openness or accessibility of data. It's related to postgraduate and graduate students working on in their dissertations and theses, getting access to data. What are you doing at 50 by 30 to make sure that data is accessible to those that want to engage in it?
Thanks for this, and it's really important because building capacity of we're not only building capacity of data producers but also of data users. And when we talk about data users, it's not just policymakers; it's also users, all kind of key stakeholders, including students, civil society, academia, that we look into. And I think that's an important point that you have mentioned, because as well we need to get agriculture data as well out of its niche. In the sense of making sure that also countries and key stakeholders see this as well as an investment and as an infrastructure for countries. So that's one thing I think that is important. Another part I think that would be very important as well is to make sure that we also have hard evidence. Again, going back to that earlier point about costing and cost effectiveness, we need to document this, because I think that's also very important in terms of our engagement with the stakeholders. We need to also document the specific data gaps that we are contributing to reduce. And in particular, one of the questions earlier was about land tenure. The survey modules we have will actually capture that. So it's really important so that we stop guessing about, for instance, gender dynamics in the sector. This is really important. So one of the parts of the initiative is that we work on increasing open data. So definitely making sure that we work also on training, not only training the producers in making data available, but also making it understandable. And that's also very important. So making that type of data dissemination platforms, making sure as well that we work with the users and the producers, bringing them together in that sense. And going back into the smallholder is one of the SDG indicators. So for instance, smallholder income 232 is also captured, is one of the indicators that we will contribute to it through the initiative as well. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll turn to Thula with, I guess, a reframing of two questions that have come up so far. We see hunger rising, but we don't necessarily see the donor response to it. And in many countries also, the response varies. So question to you, in terms of decision makers within your hierarchy in government, what is it that they need to know? What arguments would they find convincing to increase investment in the ag sector relative to others? That's one. Another question that's come up so far, I think, is what's the kind of demand that you're facing for evidence-based decision-making, and what arguments are salient for that? So with that, over to you, Thula. Thula, are you still with us? I believe your video is blocked. And
thanks, Ahmad. Sorry, no, yes, I am. It's not cooperating 100% today. Thanks for that. I actually wanted to ask if I could answer the question about the issue on investment in agriculture. I mean, one of the things, especially for a lot of my African counterparts also on this call, and if they're not, a lot of us sign on to the CADIP which was, for our national agriculture investment plans, to ensure that we at least invested 10% of our GDP back into agricultural production and capabilities, as well as within the supply chain. But a lot of us are failing on it, including Kenya. And it's obviously because we've got a lot of exchequer requirements and budget needs in terms of our infrastructure. First and foremost, you must have the correct enabling environment to at least move the food, right, and move the inputs to the producers. But we've recognized that, especially in Kenya, that health comes from having food security. So, and to the donors, it's always about saying, like I mentioned earlier, creating a holistic and integrated response for agriculture. Part of it is it's not just about looking at the 1 acre farmer, but also saying, how do we ensure that we're increasing production across the value chain, and all the actors having the capabilities to support that. Because if a farmer can grow the best amount of maize, but doesn't have the post-harvest infrastructure or the road to get to it, but that's separate, that's not agricultural investment, but at least on the post-harvest infrastructure to then be able to, say, minimize his losses or her losses. Capacity building, especially at an institutional level, is another thing that we need to look at. If you're then saying if the decision makers have all the knowledge, I mean, it's a question that was asked earlier, access to knowledge, disparities need to be responded to, and the ability to use the tools and processes. You can put in a tool, but if people aren't educated or trained on how to use it and motivated, there's no incentive to use it, right? What's the reason that I have this app? I mean, for now, yes, the donor's excited to fund it for now, but it needs to be about making sure that it just becomes part of his daily work activities. And there's a resiliency question in that. One of the questions that I had last week in the food security war room, which I lead, was all the county staff have dropped off. So I asked their county, the chair of agriculture, and she explained that it's because they don't have data to send us the data, if that makes sense. So they don't have like a WhatsApp bundle to then be able to send us the data and upload it onto our servers. So those are the basic issues that we're challenged with in terms of resiliency of tools, making sure that we have the data available to us. Even though there is a demand for that, for evidence-based, especially with regards to now, for example, our emergency fund expenditure on COVID, as well as locust response and our flood victims, we need to be able to then account for where that money went. I mean, everyone is going to be faced with it globally, but for us, it's also it's more specific towards how we've responded to the locust issue, and how we're then going to ensure that we continue to respond to it in a more sustainable manner, because it looks like it's here with us for some time.
That's both good and bad news.
Yeah, exactly.
Means that there's a lot of work to be done, and then perhaps we can do it better.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. So what I'll transition to next is I'll invite one more sort of round of questions, the final round. If there are any, if you'd like, please slip them in. We would like to make sure that we do end on time. And then what I'll ask for is for the panelists to do a 2 to 3 minute wrap up. If additional questions come in, we'll tackle them as they do. But again, from the top to the panelists, are there particular things that you would like for us to take away from today's conversation? Are there things that were eye-opening or significant for you? Are there particular key messages that you want to stay with us? I'll turn to Jaren with that.
Great, thanks, Ahmad. So I think a few of the key messages have already we're raising them kind of in this discussion. Where I think I would maybe like to kind of transition some of our discussion is to really think concretely about what it is we want to use evidence and data for, right? So we know that we want to use it for decision making, but at what level of decision making are we hoping that it will reach? And I think it's important to think about ways that we can actually structure that evidence so that we're reaching the right audience. And I'll give kind of the example of the Series 2030 project in relation to this. So one of the things that we were thinking about in this kind of very broad, very ambitious plan that we set up was to think not only how we were talking about kind of the data gaps, the evidence gaps that we have within the SDG community, but also what are kind of the tools and mechanisms by which we can build things to help ladder up to some of these problems. And what are we doing to build things that are reusable and sustainable that other communities can build upon? And so if you look at the architecture of the Series 2030 programs, there's a lot of kind of pieces that can be taken apart and reused for other purposes. And we did this very intentionally because we wanted to have an inclusive design project where we thought about, well, how would we invite other scientists, other researchers, other donors to be able to take bits and pieces and create, new evidence syntheses on other topics? How would we leverage machine learning to be able to use our techniques and projects for other SDGs, or to dig in deeper into some of the areas? How can we use economic modeling and scientific evidence to come together so that we create a cohesive picture, so that we're talking not only about, quote unquote, technical evidence, but that we're giving some costs and thoughts about how to bring that into other programs and places. So I think just in terms of the kind of the architecture of the program, we really were concentrating on how is this something that can be used by the global community in the future, maybe not exactly as it is today, but really what are the elements of kind of capacity building for understanding how to interrogate data and evidence? What are the opportunities to, again, kind of listen to the global community through using machine learning models to look not only at a small window of literature, but a very wide sector of literature? And then what are the ways in which we get both kind of researchers maybe and donors more comfortable with talking about discrete costs of what it takes to solve some of these challenges? And maybe I will just kind of end on this last point of thinking about discussion of costs. And I'll speak, very kind of personally from the researcher community here, because I think it's maybe an important message. So within kind of the research community, we don't talk about costs, and that came through very clearly in the analysis of the research and the evidence. There's very, very few scientific papers that can really connect the costs of an intervention to its outcome. And that's because we're not trained in that way. And so we need a behavior change, and we need to be kind of incentivized to think about these issues. And it's only by doing these exercises, I think, in real time and in real practice, that we can uncover these issues. So one of the things that's maybe kind of unique about Series 2030 is that we didn't develop a conceptual model. We developed the model and we executed the model, and we uncovered a lot through kind of the active practice of doing this. We learned a lot. There's certainly a lot that we would want to change, but I think it's one of the high level messages here is that when we give opportunities to kind of do things in real time, that we uncover a lot of kind of gaps and learnings that we can take away, modularize, and then hopefully put forward in kind of new and interesting ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Darren. I'll turn to David. David, any key takeaways, closing thoughts?
Yes, and I will directly, thanks for all the discussion. I will also directly follow up from Jaron. In CEST 2030, we have played with this concept of global value chain of knowledge, and I want to scale it up actually to illustrate with the discussion we have on data, in the sense that, there is a reality that then we have facts, then you have data that is an interpretation of the facts, then you move from data to knowledge, from knowledge to evidence, and to evidence to action. And you need really to have this value chain well organized, well connected, in order to deliver the final product, and that is basically better livelihood for the population. And the different agents within this value chain have to talk to each other, has to coordinate, what the policymaker want, what the people that analyze and also conceptualize and also try to anticipate what a policymaker want. Because what we have seen is SDG, you take 5 or 10 years to have policymakers deciding what should be measured, and then we say, okay, it would have been better to anticipate it a bit in order to measure it before. So actually, part of the research community is to anticipate also what the policymaker or what the society will look at to make sure we are ready. But of course, the people that are digesting, analyzing, using this data have to discuss with the people that will collect the data. Because still today, we see some data initiatives that have been not coordinated enough. And in the multidimensionality of the world we are living in now, where we care about environment, we care about health, we care about economic impact, having an economic survey on one side, a health survey on the other, is still a big source of inefficiency, and in terms of cost, but also analysis capacity for us to analyze. So working on a better integrated production system of data, knowledge, evidence for action, I think is something that now, it's not new in itself, you know, but both the tools, also the fact that it's really a decentralized approach of all of these, with researchers, with data collectors all around the world that can work together, it's quite important. The second point I want to make, in my work, in the project that we have in CEST 2030, kind of the key goal is to optimize taxpayer money. You know, we want to achieve SDG 2, and we want to get the higher rate of return, both domestically and internationally. And we try to guide basically public decision in this field. But a lot of the work we do and a lot of data we are dealing with are actually valuable for the private sectors, both for the smallholders and the biggest company. And the question, you know, about open data that came in the chat, I think are important. But just to say that, you know, beyond the public decision maker, a lot of the information we generate is also useful for the wider community, even if it is not the targeted audience, including for the discussion of today. But we should not forget that there's other people that can use the information we generate at the different stages of this value chain. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'll turn to Elisa now.
Thanks, Ahmad. Three points I'd like to get across. One is the coordinated approach among development partners and other stakeholders to adequately plan, implement, monitor, and report on progress in the various agricultural data-related initiatives in the countries. We need to have an integrated portfolio of interventions, and that's not only important for our own sort of improving our own efficacy, but also to lessen the country burden on all of these related initiatives and also to ensure data utility. The second point is really about partnerships as well, specifically with this private sector, both in terms of funding, but also in sharing technologies and researchers on fresh new approaches of on data collection and combining survey data and new data sources. So please reach out to us. We're hungry for that kind of partnerships. And the last one is really related to this particular constituency we're talking to today. And it's a collective work on repositioning agriculture statistical capacity development, using COVID-19, if need be, as an opportunity because of its impact on the labor force, the transport, investment in this sector, so that we can also show how useful our work is, and the fact that highlighting the fact that our work collects data on many aspects, environment, non-agricultural income, production methods, productivity, sociological demographics of agriculture, and rural households. So we all need to work together as well on that advocacy to make it effective. And we're ready to work with this constituency as well to make that message very clear. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. Turning to Thula, overarching question. I mean, you're talking to a donor audience, as Lisa just reminded us. What are the key takeaways for us as a group?
I think, thanks Ahmed. Elisa has taken a lot of what I wanted to say, in fact, and I'm so happy she did. So I will also be having more bilateral conversations with her, especially for the SDG platform and supporting and making sure that we implement it in Kenya. It's so important to us that not only do we collect the data, but there's utility to that data, and making sure that, you know, we ensure, especially in this sector, that most of our interventions, or policy interventions in particular, now are just data driven. But with all that said, like I mentioned in my earlier comment, what we need from our donors, because you have a lot of the best practices and a lot more innovations happening outside of the continent, supporting in terms of how to implement those in the most effective and sustainable ways. You know, we have had a lot of support with COVID from the private sector in particular, and even in terms of our donors reassigning and reallocation of funds, but it's very short term. Resiliency for us is looking at the medium term to long term horizon, so that we can ensure that we have that culture change from the anecdotal interventions to now being, especially in our regulations and legislature. We are currently looking at our agricultural reforms are data-driven right now, especially in sugar, tea and coffee, which are our strategic value chains. So for me, it's to look at the donors to then say, and the ask is generally capacity building and resilience in particular, and then some form of change management support, because even if you give us, like I mentioned, that app for the first few weeks and that the duration of that program, it's used, of course, because there is a requirement and there's a report that comes out of it. But it now needs to be something that we inherently feel is part of the way we operate in the sector. And so for me, that's my closing remark, Ahmed.
Thank you so much. Well, I'd now like to thank our panelists. I'd like to thank our organizers of Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, Jenna, Vivi, and Fabrizio, working with them there. And I'd now like to turn it to Maurizio, our hosts, really, for offering some closing remarks as we transition to think about tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Ahmad, and thank you, colleagues, and thanks to our distinguished speakers. I have to say I'm personally impressed by the level and quality of inputs today. Let me close this meeting by quoting in particular one of the takeaways that was typed in the chat box by Jaron. The importance of data to decision making will come when we help people see that data is being used by policymakers to use decisions. If data remains invisible or only as a technical good for data people, then we will have difficulty convincing anyone. So let me warmly thank you, Ahmad, Elisa, David, Jaron, and Tule. And let me also thank CEST 2030, 50 by 2030, and Data for SDGs, as well as the Gates Foundation for putting together this event and having such a great lineup today. Now, this session has provided even more reflections and options for the narrative that we are working on in view of the Food System Summit. These are clearly only some initial reflections, and a lot has emerged from our two previous sessions as well. And we need to keep every reflection into account, although we know we have only started scratching the surface. Now, before I close, I would like to remind all of you about our fourth and last session tomorrow of the Annual General Assembly, same time at 3 p.m. Rome time. We will have a special session on catalyzing responsible private sector investment for food system transformation, which will open a discussion on how global public goods and donor support can help mobilize responsible private sector investments for food systems, for the food and nutrition agenda. We have a great panel also for tomorrow. Let me just quote a few. Barry Martin, a member of the managing board at Rabobank, Shea Serey, Assistant Governor at the National Bank of Cambodia, Sean DeClean of the World Economic Forum, Ismail Sunga, CEO at the Southern African Confederation of Agricultural Unions, as well as others. So we will get a good blend of perspectives on private sector and their involvement in the food system and the nutrition agenda. Thanks again to everyone for being with us today. We hope to see you tomorrow for our final event. Goodbye and have a great day or evening.